Good afternoon, brethren. I want to welcome and thank everyone for tuning in and joining us from the various locations from around the world for the broadcast of today's Sabbath message. Today's message will be delivered by David J. Smith, and it is titled United Nations History. And I'm your host today, Tim West. This is message number 610. This is an interesting one. It is 3 television shows, and this message was compiled together in September of 1992. So some of you may have noticed that we had some technical difficulties last week. Those of you who listen in on the conference call wouldn't have noticed anything, but those who watched the 2 o'clock broadcast saw a last-minute substitute. Now, I was able to get the broadcast recorded so that you can go back now and view it at your leisure from the website. And don't forget, as soon as this weekly Sabbath ends today, Pentecost begins. And today's message begins momentarily. So grab something to sip on, some lunch or your favorite snack, find a comfortable place to relax, and enjoy today's message.
Newswatch magazine presents the analysis of world news in the light of Bible prophecy with David J. Smith.
In the pages of the Bible, it states very clearly from days of old, at least 1900 years ago, in some cases 2500 years ago, that there would come a world government. To be more specifically, in Revelation chapter 13, notice what it says in verse 1 through 6. I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise out of the sea. In Bible prophecy, a beast, according to the book of Daniel, is always a government that rises. Then when we drop down, after it gives a description of this particular beast that will occur at the very end of the age, let's drop down to verse 7 and see the extent of territory. And it's given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given unto him over all kindreds, tongues, and nations. This means every nation on earth will be affected by this end-time world government. And what will be the space of time in which this government called the beast will rule? It states that it will continue in verse 5 for 42 months. But what will happen at the end of that 42 months? Let's turn to Revelation chapter 19, verse 11 through 21. It shows that there is coming an invasion from outer space. This particular invasion will be the living Jesus Christ, which this world rejects as a whole. And he will return to this earth and the saints with him and all of his holy angels. And he will take the beast and the false prophet that will be with him for a world religion and cast them alive into a lake of fire. And they'll be burned up. If this is the case, and there is prophesied a world government that is to rise at the very end of the age, to culminate with the return of Jesus Christ and establish the true kingdom of God, how is this world government rising? Is it rising? Can you prove that it's rising and that it will happen in your lifetime? In Matthew chapter 24 of your Bible, Jesus said for us to watch. And he said that those who see all of the prophetic utterances that he gave, then that generation would not pass till all be fulfilled. There was a man by the name of Rockefeller, a whole family. They're called internationalists. They had a report concerning the foreign relations of the United States of America, the foreign policy in 1959. Notice what they said in this particular panel. This was the Rockefeller panel report on the United States foreign policy in 1959. Quote, "The United Nations stands finally as a symbol of the world order that will be built. End of quote. That's a dramatic statement from the Rockefeller panel. And when you're looking back into history, which we will do, we're going to find that those who are closely affiliated with those who gave this report indeed believe world government's coming. They're working for it and spending all their energies to create it. They honestly feel the only way to keep the world from exploding and destroying every person on the face of the earth must come through world government. But since they reject the living Jesus Christ and the God that created the world and the universe and all the intricate balance of nature, then they don't believe there is hope outside of a man-made organization called the United Nations. But let's go into the background and bring ourselves up to date on this world organization. Colonel Edward Mandell House was to President Woodrow Wilson what Henry Kissinger has been in the past to Presidents Nixon and Ford. He was a powerful behind-the-scenes manipulator who had enormous influence in shaping Woodrow Wilson's domestic and foreign policies to support economic collectivism and political internationalism. Colonel House wrote the first draft of what was called the League of Nations. It was a covenant in which nations would go into this covenant with one another to create world government. He actually named it the League of Nations. In September of 1917, President Wilson appointed House to head a committee that would devise peace terms and draft a program for a world government. This would be the peace terms that would end World War I. This group was called the Inquiry. They were incorporated various peace proposals and the League of Nations covenant into a single document which the United States Senate later rejected and therefore foiled their plan for world government. Assisting Colonel Edward Mandell House were such budding intellectuals as Walter Lippmann, Norman Thomas, Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, and Christian Herter. American internationalists expected the frustration and the disruption created by World War I to so condition the American people that the United States would enter into the League of Nations as an alleged means of avoiding future wars. However, when it became clear that the League of Nations was headed by followers that were actually laying the groundwork for world government, the Senate refused to take us into the organization. They weren't defeated. They were discouraged. But in May of 1919, these men met in Paris, France, with other like-minded Englishmen who were working for world government. The result was the formation in the United States of the American Institute of International Affairs. In 1921, the American Institute of International Affairs was merged with an already pre-existing discussion group in New York City, and they were incorporated under the name the Council on Foreign Relations. Since then, the Council on Foreign Relations has greatly influenced American foreign and domestic policies to fit the designs for world government envisioned by its founders, and has continued to condition the American people to accept the changes that were necessary so that we could enter into a world government. Americans in very recent times, the last few years, have been asking the question, why do policies that are detrimental to our nation continue to be passed into law, regardless of which political party is in power. It doesn't matter whether it's Republican or Democrat. The same policies have continued to be passed into law that continues to entangle us in world government and destroying us as a nation. An important clue to the answer can be found in the careful study of the Council on Foreign Relations. As Mr. Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, once observed, I quote, "Single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to accidental opinion of the day, but a series of oppressions begun at a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers, or every Senate, every President, every Congress, too plainly prove a deliberate, systematical plan of reducing us to slavery." End of quote. This was found in the book, The Works of Thomas Jefferson by H.A. Washington, and it was published in 1884. It was volume 1, page 130. Before the end of 1939, the State Department established a committee of post-war problems. It was composed of very high officials in the State Department. It was assisted by a research staff, which in February of 1941 was organized into a division of special research. After Pearl Harbor, on December 7th, 1941, the research facilities were expanded, and the overall project was reorganized into an advisory committee on post-war foreign policies. On the committee were a number of influential members of the Council on Foreign Relations, including Hamilton Fish Armstrong, Sumner Welles, Isaiah Bowman, Norman H. Davis, James T. Shotwell, Myron C. Taylor, and Leo Pazvalsky. The Russian-born Pazvalsky became the committee's director of research. When Pazvalsky died in 1953, Time magazine on May 18th, that edition, described him, and I quote, as the architect of the United Nations Charter. End of quote. On August 14th, 1941, President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill signed the Atlantic Charter, claiming the need for, and I quote, establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security. End of quote. On January 1st, 1942, the nations at war with the Axis powers formed a wartime coalition by signing a declaration by United Nations, pledging their adherence to the principles of the Atlantic Charter. The pieces were now beginning to fall into place to replace the old League of Nations that was rejected by the Senate of the United States, and the emergence of the United Nations to lay the foundation for world government. In the spring and summer of 1943, resolutions calling for a post-war international organizations to preserve the peace were introduced in Congress. And later in the year, President Roosevelt went to Moscow for a meeting with the foreign ministers of the United Kingdom, that's England, and the Soviet Union. The resulting Moscow Declaration, to which China also became a part, committed the four nations to close cooperation after the war and the establishment of an international organization to keep the peace. The Moscow Declaration was confirmed and strengthened at later high-level conferences at Cairo, Egypt, and Tehran, Iran, in November and December of 1943. In mid-1944, draft proposals submitted by the four governments became the basis for the Dumbarton Oates discussions that took place from August 21st to October 7th of 1944. And it was from these discussions that the basic structure of the United Nations began to emerge. The few remaining difficulties were later ironed out in February of 1945 at the notorious Yalta Conference. It was at Yalta that President Roosevelt agreed to Stalin's demand that the Soviet Union be given 3 votes in the General Assembly of the United Nations once it was formed. It wasn't very widely known, but the United States also, if our Congress balked at 3 votes for the Soviet Union, we were given 3 votes also. But since this balking by the Congress never developed, it was discarded, and so the Soviet Union had 3 votes to our 1 vote. And this could be found in the documentation Roosevelt and Hopkins by Robert E. Sherwood, 1950 publication, page 855 to 857. When the San Francisco Conference finally convened on April 25th of 1945 for the purpose of finalizing and approving the United Nations Charter, over 40 members of the United States delegation were of the Council on Foreign Relations. This indicated the success that this organization had in infiltrating the government of the United States to provide a forum for world government. Another member of the Council on Foreign Relations was very active at the San Francisco Conference. Time magazine for April 16, 1945, announced, and I quote, "The Secretary General for the San Francisco Conference was named at Yalta, but announced only last week, lanky, Harvard-trained Alger Hiss, one of the State Department's brighter young men. At San Francisco, he and his secretariat of 300 will have the drudging, thankless clerk's job of copying, translating, and publishing, running the thousands of paperclip and pencil chores of an international meeting. But Alger Hiss will be an important figure there. As Secretary General, managing the agenda, he will have a lot to say behind the scenes about who gets the breaks." End of quote. Earlier, Alger Hiss had served as State Department advisor to President Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference. He was like a shadow of Mr. Roosevelt and was executive secretary of the Dumbarton Oates Conference. He helped draft the charter, and Life magazine's Picture of the Week for July 16, 1945, portrayed a very triumphant Alger Hiss with the Charter of the United Nations at his feet. Hiss also served as director of the State Department's Office of Special Political Affairs, appointing the members of the United States delegation to the United Nations. This is very important to understand. Alger Hiss was responsible for appointing the United States delegation that finalized the charter to the United Nations. Because eventually Alger Hiss was exposed as a Soviet spy and served time in a federal penitentiary for perjuring himself before a federal grand jury while being questioned about his communist activities. This was the beginning of the United Nations organization and the Secretary General of that organization. Trygve Lie, a Norwegian socialist, followed Alger Hiss as the United Nations' first elected Secretary General after ratification of the United Nations Charter on October 24th of 1945. The October 1950 issue of Foreign Affairs, which was the Council on Foreign Relations' very influential quarterly, carried an article by Thomas J. Hamilton, also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, who was head of the United Nations Bureau of the New York Times, which noted that Trygve Lie had been brought up, quote, to see evils in both communism and capitalism, end of quote. And he excused Trygve Lie's reluctance to, and I quote, commit himself irrevocably to the anti-communist side, end of quote, on the grounds that Norway was vulnerable to Soviet reprisals. So Norway was right on the Soviets' border. And if he carried on operations in the United Nations against the Soviet Union, there might be reprisals against his nation, such as an invasion. So if this is true, this meant that the Secretary General Lie's decisions were partly influenced by Soviet extortion in the early years of the United Nations. The record indicates, however, that Trygve Lie's pro-communist activities were simply an extension of his own leftist commitment. He had been a high-ranking member of Norway's Social Democratic Labour Party, which was an offshoot of the early Communist International. And when Leon Trotsky was exiled in Norway after his feud with Joseph Stalin, Trygve Lie was the Norwegian Minister of Justice who threatened Trotsky with imprisonment if he didn't stop criticizing the Soviet Stalin's regime. When Trotsky persisted in attacking Stalin and his henchmen around Joseph Stalin, Trygve Lie had him jailed and eventually deported. All this information was found in the book The Fearful Master by Trygve Lie. Even before selecting a Secretary General to the United Nations, the newly formed United Nations had a task of choosing a president for its General Assembly. In January of 1946, the Soviet Union and its satellite became prime instigators of a drive to secure the post for Trygve Lie. That documentation is found in the book In the Cause of Peace by Trygve Lie. Nevertheless, Lie was narrowly defeated by Belgium socialist Paul Henry Spaak, which was a setback which left him available for the much more influential post of the Secretary General. In the subsequent campaign for this higher office in the United Nations, the Soviets once again assumed the role of virtual campaign manager for Trygve Lie. Once again, that's page 171 of his book, In the Cause of Peace. And following his confirmation, Trygve Lie fully justified the confidence that the communists had placed in him. As was noted in the Council on Foreign Relations publication, Foreign Affairs, quote, prior to his intervention on Korea, Mr. Lie had supported Soviet moves in the Cold War and criticized those of the United States more often than he had supported the United States. In the early months of 1950, for example, Lai had begun a campaign to achieve the communist goal of having Red China admitted to the United Nations. And on another occasion, he considered handing in his resignation as a means of protesting a position taken by the United States on another issue. He went to see Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, who expressed alarm that he was going to resign. Then Trygve Lie changed his mind. Gromyko called Moscow, and Moscow replied that Trygve Lie should stay in the United Nations organization. I just wanted to give you an introduction to the United Nations and the background of those individuals who originally founded the organization, to show you that it was 100% socialist, communist, and those who are coming on the scene today saying that the Cold War is over and that the Soviet Union, now called a Commonwealth, is no longer a threat to us, that this is a drastic mistake. Even after Mikhail Gorbachev seemingly was taken out of office and replaced by Boris Yeltsin, he came to the United States of America and stated very clearly that he wanted to bolster and strengthen the United Nations organization and let it be a world government. And yet we've seen from the very outset who it was that founded the United Nations. All the way back during World War I, when the League of Nations failed for world government, they immediately started plotting and planning to bring about another world war so that out of the rubbles of it, the world would wait for the call for world government. So the United Nations was born by Colonel Edward Mandell House and others who were associated with him. As a direct result, the very foundation of the United Nations organization is based upon world socialism, world communism, and it's going to be a world superstate which will end up being a nightmare for all peoples in the Western world, especially Christians. You and I are not going to be raptured in advance of this horrifying time that is approaching just before us. Jesus Christ said at the last trump, he would send his angels and they would come and they would gather the very elect. But until that time, the beast is rising. It will affect you. It will affect you. You had better begin to prepare to meet Jesus Christ, your Lord and your Savior, and to find out what his everlasting covenant is, and repent and begin to get in harmony with it, because Jesus Christ is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. He is returning.
Newswatch Magazine presents the analysis of world news in the light of Bible prophecy with David J. Smith.
Last week we were talking about the United Nations organization, and the founding fathers of that organization was Alger Hiss, and we showed that he was a socialist communist. And then the first Secretary General of the United Nations organization was Trygve Lie. He also was a socialist. Turn in your Bible with me now to Revelation chapter 13. Verse 1 through 6 shows dramatically that there will come at the end of the age a beast government. That government is going to rise out of the sea of humanity. The only organization that fits the description of that today in the 20th century is that of the United Nations organization. It shows in verse 1 that it will rise, and Satan in verse 2 will give it its authority. Then down in verse 5 it says it'll continue for 42 months or 3.5 years. And in verse 7 it tells us, 6 and 7, it tells us that every nation, language, and people will be a part of it. And it will exist right on down until the very return of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Now turn with me in your Bible to Revelation chapter 19. In verse 11 through the remainder of the chapter, it shows clearly that one riding on a white horse, and it's identified as the Word. And the Word of God, according to John chapter 1 verse 14, is Jesus Christ. He will return with all God's holy angels and the saints with him, and take hold of the beast, the false prophet, cast them alive into a lake of fire. He will destroy the military apparatus of this end-time world government, known as the United Nations Organization. Trygve Lie, the first Secretary General of the United Nations Organization, retired at the conclusion of his second term and was succeeded on April 10th, 1953 by Sweden's Dag Hammarskjöld. He was yet another socialist. So the founders of the United Nations Organization, the entire contingency of the United States, were socialist, communist. Then the first Secretary General, Trygve Lie, was a socialist from Norway. Then the second man who headed up the United Nations Organization was from Sweden, Dag Hammarskjöld, also a socialist. Hammarskjöld once wrote to a friend, I quote, "I think I was 12 years old when I had a very strong feeling that I am a new Jesus." End of quote. Dag Hammarskjöld thought that he was going to come on the scene and be a world savior. And that was quoted in the New York Daily News, October 14th, 1965. And on another occasion, he wrote of communist Chinese butcher Zhou Enlai that, I quote, "To me he appears as the most superior brain I have so far met in the field of foreign politics." End of quote. That was also in the New York Times, December 4th, 1972. So Hammarskjöld did coddle up to the communist. He thought the Chinese communist leader was one of the most powerful brains in the world at that time. Hammarskjöld was primarily responsible for the early planning and direction of the United Nations war against anti-communist Katanga in the early 1960s, during which the United Nations moved to crush Katangan independence by conducting a vicious military operation that included the bombing of hospitals, attacks on ambulances, and general violence against the civilian population that was so extreme that the 46 civilian doctors in the Katangan capital of Elizabethville, who had to care for the dead and for the wounded, sent telegrams to world leaders imploring them to intervene, and I quote, "to stop the terrorist bombardment of hospitals and civilian populations by the United Nations." End of quote. These same doctors also issued a very lengthy report, and that was entitled 46 Angry Men. It accompanied pictorial examples of the United Nations atrocities, documenting the horror that the United Nations peacekeeping troops inflicted in the name of peace. And there was an excellent overview on the United Nations war against Katanga in that book, 46 Angry Men, pages 3 to 64. Today, thanks in large part to the United Nations Operation the Katanga government, which was formerly the Belgium Congo. It is now called Zaire, and it is ruled by communists. All because of the atrocities of the United Nations organization in helping to overthrow that peace-loving country for communists. All of its mineral wealth and its vast supplies of nuclear raw materials fell into the hands of the communists. Hammarskjöld was also responsible for the persecution of the Danish United Nations diplomat Paul Bang Jensen. After Bang Jensen refused to turn over to Hammarskjöld a list of Hungarian refugees who had testified in confidence to a special United Nations committee that investigated the 1956 anti-communist uprising in Hungary. The refugees feared reprisals against relatives in Hungary if their names were revealed to the public. Bang Jensen, an assistant secretary of the United Nations Committee, had promised to keep the names confidential, and when he attempted to keep his word, Dag Hammarskjöld had him suspended and subjected him to an incredible campaign of harassment and character assassination. Bang Jensen's appeal for reinstatement was pending when he was found dead of a bullet wound in a New York park on November 24th, 1959. His death was quickly labeled a suicide, but a subsequent investigation by the United States Senate Subcommittee raised the real possibility that he had been the victim of a Soviet MVD assassination. Following his death, it was publicly revealed that Bang Jensen had been in contact with a Soviet national at the United Nations who wanted to defect and expose Soviet penetration of both the United Nations Secretariat and in the American intelligence community. All that was found in the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, the Bang Jensen Report, September 14th, 1961. Whether Bang Jensen committed suicide or was murdered by the MVD to protect their agents in the United Nations organization, it seems very clear that his death was directly related to the frustrating attempt to maintain his integrity and anti-communist position within a very pro-communist United Nations hierarchy. He had gone back on his word to the Hungarian freedom fighters, as demanded by Secretary General Hammarskjöld, and simply ignored the would-be Soviet defector. If he hadn't have gone back on his word and ignored that defector, he probably would be alive today. Dag Hammarskjöld himself died in a plane crash in northern Rhodesia on September 18th of 1961. Prior to that incident, much publicity had been given to an alleged Soviet attempt to undermine the office of Secretary General with demands for what they call a troika arrangement, which would replace that office with a different type of organization, and it would be composed of representatives of the communist nations. But Western and neutral nations would not be a part, as far as they could tell. And this was simply another plot by the communist countries to overthrow and take the United Nations organization to become truly a one-world organization to guarantee that the United Nations would be the super socialist world government that would eventually bring pure communism to the world. Another man by the name of U Thant became the third Secretary General of the United Nations. Taunt's Marxist background and anti-Americanism dominated his years as Secretary General. He consistently feigned concern about racism in the world, but was always very careful to ignore racism in communist countries, while he used it as an excuse to undermine every anti-communist country that he pinpointed for attack. After concluding the United Nations war against black rule anti-communist Katanga, he turned his attention to the white rule anti-communist regimes of South Africa and Rhodesia. Under Thant's leadership, Rhodesia became the target of the first economic sanctions ever voted for by the United Nations organization. In contrast to his hysterical anti-Rhodesia position, in early 1969, U Thant called for an end to the economic boycott of communist Cuba, which also were cited as a very racist regime by those on the international community not affiliated with the United Nations organization. He stated, I quote, "I'm always for the termination of the isolation or segregation of any member of the international community. I am always for the survival of contacts and communications and exposure, as I have said," end of quote. That was found in Human Events magazine, March 15th, 1969. So actually, Mr. U Thant deceived the world by lifting sanctions against a communist country while enforcing them against an anti-communist country. In his annual report to the United Nations released in September 1966, Mr. U Thant claimed, quote, "the most conspicuous and anachronistic mass violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms is that which continues to be enforced against the non-white majority of the people of South Africa," end of quote. This was utter nonsense, since the worst violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms had been and were occurring in the Soviet Union, Red China, Cuba, and other countries that were held by the communists. And the victims were a majority comprising all races, creeds, and colors. No word was ever spoken of the millions held in concentration camps, 11,000 concentration camps by the communist regimes. Instead, U Thant followed the communist line and vented his entire wrath against anti-communist Rhodesia and South Africa, which were very stable anti-communist countries that stabilized the entire continent of Africa. During the Vietnam War, Mr. U Thant consistently used his prestige and influence to undermine the United States and propagandize for the communists. On July 30th, 1967, he described the conflict in Vietnam as a war of national independence rather than one of communist aggression. That was exactly following the communist line, and even likened the position of North Vietnam to that of the American colonies during the Revolutionary War. That was found in the Washington Post, July 31st, 1967. So clearly, history points out that U Thant was very pro-communist and was seeking a communist world government. On April 7th, 1970, the Los Angeles Times carried the following very revealing article, quote, United Nations Associated Press release. Secretary General U Thant praised Vladimir Lenin, founder of the Soviet Union, as a political leader whose ideals were reflected in the United Nations Charter. U Thant released Monday the text of a statement sent to a symposium of Lenin at Tampere, Finland, sponsored by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Lenin was a man with a mind of great clarity and incisiveness, and his ideas have had a profound influence on the course of contemporary history, Thant's statement said. Lenin's ideals of peace and peaceful coexistence among states have won widespread international acceptance, and they are in line with the aims of the United Nations Charter. End of quote. Every coalition government that had ever existed, right on up until the time that Mr. Mikhail Gorbachev came to the United States on May 7th, 1992, and said strengthen the United Nations as a world instrument for government. Every coalition government became a communist government. No exceptions have ever occurred. Now, when we consider U Thant's admiration for Lenin, it should come as no surprise to learn that he chose as his personal assistant one Viktor Lesavsky, an officer of the Soviet KGB. The two became so close that U Thant gave his baby daughter a Burmese name. Named the daughter of his KGB assistant after himself. When it was drawn to U Thant's attention that the Soviet official was a KGB official, the Secretary General U Thant simply brushed it off. That was found in the book The Secret Work of Soviet Agents, the KGB, by a Mr. John Barron, page 19. U Thant retired in December 31st, 1971, at the conclusion of his second term. 10 days earlier, Mr. Kurt Waldheim of Austria had been chosen by the Security Council to succeed U Thant as Secretary General. As reported in the New York Times of December 22nd, quote, one of Mr. Waldheim's greatest assets in his successful campaign was that he was the preferred candidate of the Soviet Union from an early stage. End of quote. Thus far, even going into the early 1970s, every Secretary General of the United Nations had been the preferred candidate of the Soviet Union. Can there be any doubt why the United Nations adopted a charter which read identical practically to that of the Soviet Union? And when it was signed as treaty formation, it became the supreme law of the United States of America? And that when we have elected officials who go into the office of the presidency or Senate and House of Representatives, and we wonder why every law is passed that is to the detriment of the United States, it's because those laws have to conform to the Charter of the United Nations, which is a socialist world supergovernment in the formation. Red China could have vetoed the nomination of Mr. Kurt Waldheim, but instead they chose to abstain. And so he was elected and selected as the leader of the new United Nations organization. As the Times put it, Communist China's abstention meant Mr. Waldheim's election was made possible. A few months earlier, Waldheim had received 47% of the vote as the presidential candidate of Austria's Catholic People's Party. He ran so inoffensive a campaign that the victorious socialists returned him to the United Nations as their representative and backed his candidacy for the Secretary General of that organization. That was found in the New York Times, December 22nd, 1971. So Waldheim did not even try to win the election in Austria. Rather, he was rewarded for his non-victory with the Secretary Generalship of the United Nations, where he could be more effective in bringing about a socialized world government. Waldheim's native Austria was the first free country to fall victim to Adolf Hitler's aggression. An article in the Boston Pilot for January 1st, 1971 reported, and I quote, "Never having engaged in politics, Waldheim survived the Nazi occupation of Austria without stigma. As a soldier in World War II, he was wounded in 1942. End of quote. If it was in 1942 and you're wounded as an Austrian soldier, then you would end up fighting for a regime that had captured your country. In other words, Waldheim would have been fighting on the side of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis for Germany. Hilaire du Barrier reported in the Review of the News for January 26, 1972, that Waldheim served as, and I quote, an infantry lieutenant with the swastika on his collar. End of quote. Kurt Waldheim was going along as usual, getting along because he was a socialist. In 1968, the Soviet Union invaded Austria's neighbor, Czechoslovakia. Rather than condemn the communists, Mr. Waldheim approved the Soviets taking over of that country. As the Pilot Dispatch reported, quote, Dr. Waldheim is also gratefully remembered in Moscow for helping to soothe tensions in Austria during the Soviets' August 1968 invasion of neighboring Czechoslovakia. End of quote. So Kurt Waldheim fully concurred in the United Nations 1984 style drive to obliterate every last vesture of free China within the United Nations organization. They ousted free China and put in a communist regime that had murdered millions and put others in concentration camps. Do we really believe there is a world government rising? Can you believe it? All the documentation that has been given about the United Nations organization absolutely, undeniably proves that that organization was founded upon the communist socialist philosophy. Its entire charter was practically word for word the Soviet Union's charter. It was designed as a world socialist superstate. It was designed to enslave humanity so that mankind would be a slave state. And only a few people ruling the world would be governing all other people. Did you also realize that this same beast government rising, according to Revelation chapter 13, verse 16 and 17, is going to have an economic system? And in 1972 and 3, they declared the new international economic order, in which they now will be using marks. It is called in the Bible the mark of the beast. This end time system will have an economic policy which you and I, unless we have these marks put on our right hand or our forehead, we will not be able to buy and sell in this new United Nations world government and the new international economic policy that has been brought into existence. Yes, the Bible is the most accurate document ever written in the world. It has given history in advance. In the book of Revelation, at least 1900 years in advance. It's written for the end of the age, the very close, the consummation of the age, leading up to the return of Jesus Christ. This end time system will finally gain complete control and be in charge for 42 months, 3.5 years. And then the living Jesus Christ will return. You cannot stop the events that are going to occur. They will happen whether you believe it or not. This world government will not be for your benefit. It will not bring lasting peace.
Newswatch Magazine presents the analysis of world news in the light of Bible prophecy with David J. Smith.
Ancient Egypt, they had what was called a cartouche. This was a seal which, when they would send a document, they would seal it with hot wax. This ring or cartouche would put the official symbol of the organization. And so when someone received this letter or scroll, as it was in those days, the official symbol would be on it. They would know that it was from the master of the lodge. One original scarab, which was used for hundreds of years in Egypt by various officials to impress the seal of the mystic Rosicrucian fraternity in wax on all of the official documents, was given to the Grand Lodge of the United States of America with other jewels and papers of an official nature. It's considered to be one of the rarest antiquities of Egypt that's now in this country. Why is this important to understand? Listen to direct quotes from the official history of the Rosicrucians. The first order, secret order in the history of the world, in which all other secret orders came from, and all other secret orders have identical doctrines or very similar doctrines. Quote, "The order here in America is to be congratulated on having in its possession one of the oldest, if not the most sacred, of all mystic jewels, one which has never been used by others than the masters in Egypt. For it means virtually the passing of the master, who is Satan's spirit, from Egypt to America, as was planned by the founders of America centuries ago." End of quote. Do we understand what this means? This literally means that Satan, the devil, transferred his headquarters, and from those people who were to carry out his master plan for world domination, from Egypt to the United States of America. And we're going to find out who is it that's leading the world today to a new world order. Has anybody seen that phrase on television openly? I have. And it did not come from Egypt, did it? Well, if this seal and all of its documents have been passed to the United States of America, notice what was in writing in 1538 BC. In their own documents, page 23 to 28. In this connection, see, Thutmose III built 2 obelisks. Have you ever seen a picture of the obelisk that's in the Washington Monument? That's an obelisk. Have you ever seen the one in Central Park in New York City? That's an obelisk. In this connection, it may be explained, I'm quoting from their official literature, that the obelisk in Central Park, one of the two erected in Egypt by Thutmose III, and intended to stand someday in the country where the eagle spreads its wings. Anybody know a nation that has the eagle as its national bird with its wings spread? Only America. Where did the jewels come from? Egypt. Did they say it passed the master's spirit on to this country? The Rosicrucians. They're behind all other Masonic lodges, all other types of secret societies. According to Rosicrucian Illuminati member H. Spencer Lewis, who wrote the book, the advanced thinkers of America are now in charge of the final secrets, establishing the secrets of the Novus Ordo Seclorum. Novus Ordo Seclorum means New Order of the Ages, or New World Order. The masters or Satan's spirit was transferred from Egypt to America. So the United States of America would now lead the world toward the New World Order. Did anyone happen to see President George Bush, when he called for war against Iraq in January of 1981, stand up and state clearly that there was a chance for the New World Order? And he's used it in over 200 speeches, over 200 times in all of his speeches since that time. Is he going, according to newspaper clippings which we've quoted and printed, to Egypt December 31st, 1999, to help bring in the new millennium? And the new millennium at the Great Pyramid of Cheops is the new millennium is what only New Agers are looking forward to? Because you see, it's a new cycle. It's the age of Aquarius, the golden age beginning. And only those in the occult know what that means. So why would he be going there? If he is a Christian and believes in the same God we do. I want to go back now in history just a little bit. We've already seen that the Illuminati name was mentioned in 1538 BC. Now remember, this is from the official printing press of the Rosicrucians. It states, quote, in 1203 BC, several of the brothers of the order who were of the Illuminati were commissioned to go into other lands and spread the lodge doctrines by the establishment of other lodges. It is quite apparent that Egypt was to be subjected to a devastation and that its great learning might be lost. End of quote. So they wanted to spread it to the other nations so that this great learning would not be lost. And it was finally decided that they wouldn't necessarily hastily go out and spread the lodges, but they would have people to come into their brotherhood and train, so they would have all the secret doctrines and then travel out away from Egypt and spread it. And of all things, in the year 1000 BC, there came into Egypt a man, and his name was called Solomon. And in the Rosicrucian book, it stated that the history of this man in Palestine as king of Israel is well known, so they wouldn't go into his history. He learned all about the brotherhood. No wonder he went back and used the great temple built for God Almighty and turned it into a paganized system. He was a member of the Great White Brotherhood. And he received 1,000 wives and concubines from all over the world, and they all worshiped their own individual gods. No wonder the Bible said in 1 Kings 11, when he was old, his heart was turned away from God. No, he went and learned these secrets and delved into them. To be exact, there is a symbol today. It's a 6-pointed star, which is nothing but 2 triangles interlaced with each other. Anyone who knows anything about occultic symbols know that the triangle is one of the 3 most powerful symbols in all of the secret occults. And when you put two triangles interlaced with each other, it was called Solomon's seal. And Solomon was a part of the occult. Out of the book Kabbalah by Charles Ponce, and he is a member of the occult, and he was writing how Kabbalahism could be used. He shows this symbol to be of occultic origin, and he said it's one of the greatest symbols of the occult. Now, if this is true, just think of the legacy that's been handed down ever since that time by those who follow the secret books in Judaism called the occult, called the Kabbalah. It's witchcraft. Solomon now had two men that traveled to Egypt with him. And I want to give a little background. I think it's awfully important for us to understand modern day events and what are happening. He had two men who traveled to Egypt to learn of the Great White Brotherhood. One of them's name was Huram Abi of Tyre, and another's name was Hiram Abiff. And in all the Freemasonic lodges, there is always a little play acted out. Hiram Abiff is a part of it. And he was one of the constructors of the temple. And one of the secrets is they're all going to go back one day and build a temple. But what is so interesting is that when Thebes, Egypt, they decided not to make it the center for the secret society anymore. And they moved to another part of the world, and they built a new temple. And it was in the shape of a cross. And yet this was 1,300 years before Jesus was ever born. You can go to an encyclopedia put out by the Catholic Church, and it'll have a page, when you look under crosses, there'll be 40 separate crosses, and they state there that every one of them came out of paganism. Every one of them. And yet Christians wear crosses around their neck. I've seen earrings with crosses. I've seen them as symbols hanging in their cars. And they think that it's a symbol of Jesus, when it's not. It's a satanic symbol, right out of the occult. That shows the infiltration of occultism into the truth of God. It's changed the truth into a lie, is basically what it's done. All right, let's go back to Egypt just one more moment. According to the Rosicrucians, in 1378 BC, Amenhotep IV was born. He was crowned king of Egypt in 1367 BC at the age of 11. Their official documentation state that all the secret doctrines which were handed down in Egypt from this man forward are with us today. He's the one who wrote beautiful prayers, psalms, and chants. And the organization uses those identical chants today. What is a chant? Anyone who studied into the occult knows that when you sit around and chant, it's called a mantra, where you're emptying your mind of your conscious, rational thoughts, and you're opening up for outside influence, and Christians know they are spirit guides in the occult or demons. And yet these are done in every secret society lodge. Also, it says of this man that an inspiration came to him that he would use the sun as the symbol of life. And that is handed down in every single secret society lodge today. I've known of people who have rented a Masonic lodge to hold church services before. And right there where the Master Mason stands, behind him is a sun with the rays emanating out from it. Always in the east. What does it say in Ezekiel chapter 8? When people went into the temple that was erected to God, the true God of the universe. And they bowed down facing the east and worshiped the Queen of Heaven, Isis. Or in Babylonian terminology, Semiramis. And then it was changed to Easter. And it's spelled identical. Astaroth, the Queen of Heaven. Oh yes, we've been told many things by these secret societies. They've changed the truth of God into lies, and Christians continue in those lies, thinking it's from God, but they never look into the Bible to see where they got what they believe and why they're doing it. Amenhotep IV started monastic life. He started the first monastery, and it's passed down to us today through the Roman Catholic Church. You want proof? Amenhotep IV, quote, built a new capital at El Amarna in the plain of Hermopolis on a virgin site at the edge of the desert, and abandoned Thebes. So they got away from Thebes, Egypt, as their center. At El Amarna, he also built a large temple for the Brotherhood in the form of a cross, and a large number of houses for his council, so the other members of the Brotherhood. Here was the beginning of monastic life. For within the boundaries of El Amarna lived 296 brothers of the order, each having taken an oath never to pass beyond the shadow of the temple. End of quote. They would all live there for the rest of their life. Isn't this interesting? To find out that even in the greatest body of Christianity today, they have the identical orders that was used in the White Brotherhood, which was worshiping Satan, not the God of the Bible. Here is the Catholic People's Encyclopedia, put out by the official press in Chicago, Illinois. And I want to make sure that's seen. Right here, the Catholic Press Incorporated, Chicago, Illinois. And it shows in detail a Franciscan monk, every piece of apparel that he wears, his headgear, even to the belt around his waist, and it is identical to that described in the Great White Brotherhood of the Rosicrucians. No difference whatsoever. So here is the occult. Worshippers of Lucifer, they use the cross as its sacred symbol. Now do we begin to understand why our Savior Jesus Christ died on a cross or an upright stake or obelisk? Because those who have looked into this realize that an upright stake or obelisk is nothing more than what is called phallic worship. Those in the secret societies, which I've written about before, worship the male and female sex organs. And an obelisk was a male penis erected. And now they've killed Jesus on the very type of stake which they worshipped and was sacred to them. That's okay, because you see, he came to save all, not just the few of us. Eventually, everybody on the face of the earth is going to have opportunity for salvation. Now, during the Middle Ages, the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, the organization of the Illuminati began to rejuvenate itself. They had worked in secret. Heads of every government on earth were part of it. Now, let's bring it to the very present day. And let's talk about today. I wanted to give you the groundwork to show you where it came from and how old this organization really is. You see, Satan, since the Garden of Eden, really has been trying to overthrow mankind, because you and I were promised to become sons of the living God. He was cast out. He is to be destroyed eventually. But he's doing his work today. And when his work is finished, then all mankind will have opportunity to understand the truth and what part he played in it. There is another organization, a secret society, called Skull and Bones at Yale University. There was a man who stood up in 1991 in January and gave a speech and said, "We now have our chance for the new world order," who was initiated into this organization in 1947. In that initiation ceremony, each person is said to have died to his old life. And now he is born again, and he's given a new name. Mr. George Walker Bush, President of the United States, Skull and Bones' name is Poppy. P-O-P-P-Y. He is a knight. That's one of their terminologies for members of it. Skull and Bones is only one of several key groups and secret societies in the 20th century that are working for world government. The men who will be unmasked will be from all of these various organizations. They operate behind the scenes in shadowy covers and front organizations, never exposing themselves. Some of those organizations are the Vatican's Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the Priory of Sion, the Grand Orient Lodge, the Knights Templar, the Royal Order of the Garter, which is in England, the Rosicrucians, and Freemasonry, especially those handpicked in the 33rd degree, which is an honorary degree. Those at the top echelon of all these organizations are the ones who are told the mystery of the Novus Ordo Seclorum. They've also established some very special and highly influential organizations, many of which have very clandestine aims and goals. Included are the Bilderbergers, the Club of Rome. I'm mentioning these now for later when I'm about to conclude this message. The Bilderbergers, the Club of Rome, the Aspen Institute, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bohemian Grove, the Lucis Trust, and its official name when it was founded was Lucifer, and they changed it to Lucis Trust because there were so many in opposition to the name Lucifer. Then World Goodwill. They always work out of the United Nations organization. All these groups are part of one gigantic, unified global network collectively called the Great White Brotherhood or the Secret Brotherhood. They also are identified as the Illuminati because they are Illuminized men, men who have been initiated into the occultic rites, and they have actually received the initiation into the Brotherhood by Lucifer. There are 9 men presently who pass on power and authority to these other front groups. They meet regularly at various locations around the globe, and they bring at some of these meetings even presidents, leaders in industry. They map out the future of the world and humanity. And you and I cannot escape it. It's Satan's final attempt at world government. Once they make a decision or set a policy in motion, the entire apparatus of the secret White Brotherhood snaps together to implement this program. It's like some piece of complex, intricate, well-oiled machinery. And suddenly when the orders are passed down, it all begins to work together. As president, Mr. George Bush surrounded himself with fellow brothers of Skull and Bones organization and other interlinking secret societies, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission. All of his appointments are loaded with those individuals. On the very day that he kicked off his presidency, President Bush signaled his unchanging allegiance to the Great White Brotherhood. How did he do it? At his inauguration ceremony, this was his oath of office. He was sworn in as president. His hand rested on the Masonic Bible. furnished to him by the St. John's Masonic Lodge, address 71 West 23rd Street, New York City. It was the very same Bible printed in London, England in 1767 that was used for the inauguration of fellow Freemason Warren G. Harding, Dwight David Eisenhower, and Jimmy Carter. These three presidents were all Masons, as is George Bush. And this came from the Royal Arch Mason magazine, spring of 1991, page 15, their own official documents. Ronald Reagan was not a Mason. That's why he did not take the oath of office on this Bible. However, in 1987, only a few months before his second term was completed, President Reagan was inducted into the secret world of Freemasonry as an honorary 33rd degree Mason, and his picture was on the front cover of one of the Masonic magazines called New World. For Mr. George Bush's national security advisor and his right-hand man, notice who he chose. Brent Scowcroft. He is in the intelligence information gathering. He's also connected with international bankers. He had previously been president of Kissinger and Associates. Kissinger has been in the Illuminati and in many of the secret organizations all of his life. He was a double agent during World War II for communism. This was found in U.S. News and World Report, October 7th, 1991, page 2829. It's no secret. This organization, Kissinger and Associates, is the world's most prestigious and influential lobbying firm, ruled and headed by Henry Kissinger, who was the former Secretary of the State and the most powerful man when Richard Nixon Ford stumbled, and he ran the country. In turn, Kissinger was actually hired out of a university teaching position by billionaire David Rockefeller, who heads up the secret organization's Council on Foreign Relations and founded the Trilateral Commission. He also kicked off the Bilderberger meeting with a first speech in 1991 at Baden-Baden, Germany. David Rockefeller, I believe, is indisputably one of the world's richest men. He is one of the chief power brokers in the world today. And he has the highest regard for members of the Skull and Bones organization. To be exact, Rockefeller Financial Services Incorporated, which is the main corporation entity of the Rockefeller's extensive financial wealth and his business empire, is personally managed by a Skull and Bones Richard Dilworth of the class of 38, Yale University's Skull and Bones Secret Society. I could go through the official initiation into Skull and Bones, but it would be too gruesome, and I won't do it publicly. In 1973, David Rockefeller, with the help of some of his disciples, Zygmunt Brzezinski and Averell Harriman, Averell Harriman was inducted into the Skull and Bones fraternity in 1917, along with George Bush's father, Prescott Bush. They founded the Trilateral Commission working for world government. The Trilateral Commission is a group with a goal of hastening world government and promoting an international economics controlled by those of the secret brotherhood. Now remember, Brzezinski was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. He was intelligence coordinator, the same position that was held by Henry Kissinger in the Nixon and Ford administration. And now it's held by Brent Scowcroft. All of them from the same secret organizations. No wonder nothing ever changes in Washington, D.C. Because Egypt sent the spirit of the masters to the United States of America, and we, this nation, is to finish the project of New World Order. George Bush has served in the past as director of the Globalist Trilateral Commission. Also, Council on Foreign Relations. While both Jimmy Carter and Henry Kissinger have active membership in the same organizations. Isn't it unusual that the same people from the same fraternities seem to operate in government? All the time. It never fails. It was Richard Nixon who played the key political part in helping a young bonesman from Skull and Bones by the name of George Bush into the political arena. It was Richard Nixon also who was backed by David Rockefeller. So these people just seem to interlock with each other. In other words, David Rockefeller, who is a billionaire, chairman of the multinational corporation Chase Manhattan Bank that makes loans even to Russia, and they have an office at number 1 Red Square in Moscow, head of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is a Bilderberger overseer and founder of the Trilateral Commission. Has, through his insiders in the Oval Office of the White House in Washington, D.C., been able to manipulate foreign policy and economic policies of the United States for the last 30 to 40 years, and his predecessors. Events have now proven over the last 12 years that President George Bush is in the hands of these men. He is now operating to systematically carry out the blueprint and the agenda of the secret brotherhood, the Great White Brotherhood. And he was placed in his position by fellow bonesmen the minute he graduated from Yale University. To be exact, the head of Pennzoil first hired him at a very prestigious job and taught him the oil business. And then he went into his own oil company, Zapata Oil Company. And then he was handled by other fellow bonesmen and headed right up through the ranks into the CIA and every other governmental post, which he never qualified for one position. But he was appointed there by fellow Skull and Bones fraternity members. In other words, President George Bush, when he stated he had a mission, knew that he had a mission because from birth, his father had been selected to nurture him right on into the presidency of the United States and the leadership into the New World Order. From birth, according to all the documents of his past. And we will print them eventually in Newswatch magazine. There was a man by the name of Guy Molyneux. He puts out a political newspaper. It's called the Commonwealth Report. Here's what he said, quote, "This is Bush's only existential belief that politics is based on the personal relationship of leaders, that doing business means hammering things out with a handful of major figures," end of quote. That was in the LA Weekly, January 4th to the 10th, 1991, page 13. George Bush knows that as President of the United States, he must go to that handful of world leaders who are planning the program. Once he receives directions from them, he implements it as President of the United States. There is no other way that it can be carried out. Do you realize that the CIA is mentioned very often in world conspiracy, in intervening in other nations to overthrow governments? Now, these are free market governments, and they set up communists, and they set up pro-one world sympathizers, or they set up members of the Freemasonic fraternity into those places of leadership. According to the investigations that have been run by myself and other people like Tex Mars, who've written books like Dark Majesty, and so on, and other books, the CIA has been controlled and the Secret Service gathering information from Great Britain has been controlled by fellow bonesmen of George Bush and the Freemasonic Order for a long time now. To be exact, there's evidence even supporting the fact that it was created so that they could have their own government-sponsored secret society to gather information globally. And it was not accidental that George Bush was appointed to the head of the Central Intelligence Agency in the 1970s, because he was a member of Skull and Bone. He was chosen to learn that part of the apparatus. Nor was it mere coincidence that another man by the name of William Casey, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan as head of the CIA. Because you see, William Casey was a member of the Knights of Malta, also a secret society working in conjunction with Skull and Bones and Freemasonry to carry out the plan. Lady Queensborough, in her highly acclaimed 2-volume work, Occult Theocracy, said this, and I quote, "Ancient and accepted Scottish rites of Masonry runs its own secret service, which cooperates with the national secret services of all countries, thus serving the aims and purposes of internationalism." End of quote. If this is the case, no wonder secret services all over the world can overthrow governments, and they're never for a free society. Why is it after the Illuminati-sponsored United Nations organization, country after country after country went behind the Iron Curtain? Because the Illuminati sponsored communism. That's why. That's simple. You can go back into our own history and into the congressional record of the United States and see who sent money into Russia to overthrow that country. International bankers such as Chase Manhattan, such as Kuhn Loeb, such as J.P. Morgan Trust. Now, there was a man who was vice president. His name was George Bush. He let the thousands of assembled delegates and the tens of millions of others who were watching by global television know that he had a destiny, which he described as a mission that he must perform. In fact, his speech had 10 times the word mission in it. The Secret Brotherhood always refers to its great work, which is the illumination of mankind. It's a glorious mission to them. They must let all mankind be illuminated by Lucifer and the spirit guides who are leading the evolution of man to godhood. This is the secret mission. And in order to achieve it, they must create world government in which they rule it. Now listen to just a couple of lines by Mr. George Bush. Quote, "I am a man who sees life in terms of missions defined and missions completed. The most important work of my life is to complete the mission we started in 1980. That was President Reagan and Vice President Bush. Let me tell you more about the mission. A nation's leader must be able to define and lead a mission." End of quote. See how many times the word mission was in 3 sentences? So George Bush knows without doubt he has a mission. Was George Bush referring to the sun god, the divine radiant center in each man, in his acceptance speech at the Republican convention in 1988? To find the answer, we have to turn to the president's most famous phrase, his reference to the magic of 1,000 points of light. In his speech in New Orleans at the convention where he accepted the presidential nomination, George Bush electrified everybody when he stated the following, quote, "This is America, the Knights of Columbus, the Grange, Hadassah, the Disabled Veterans, the Order of Ahipa, the Business and Professional Women of America, the Union Hall, the Bible Study Group, a brilliant diversity spread like stars, like 1,000 points of light in a broad and peaceful sky. End of quote. Nobody knew what he was talking about unless you were a part of the secret orders, Skull and Bones, Freemasonry, and you were at the very top of the echelon. 1,000 points of light. What does this very cryptic or occultic phrase really mean? In occult language, George Bush literally meant the spread and growth of the Universalist secret doctrine of Masonry. One world government. That's what he meant. This phrase is well understood by trained occultists. In the book by Alice Bailey, Discipleship in a New Age, and she was a tremendous occultist, wrote 25 books. She says this, I am a point of light within a greater light. What did George Bush said? 1,000 points of light? She says she's only one light within a greater light. I am a spark of sacrificial fire focused within the fiery will of the sun god. End of quote. I've put out magazines called The God of the New World Order, absolutely proving from all of their own literature that they worship the sun as God, and the rays that come out from it represents the illumination of mankind, but it's Lucifer, and they call him by name. And that when an individual is initiated into the Luciferic order of the secret occults, he becomes a light, a point of light. So George Bush is calling for 1,000 points of light all over the globe to expand the program. There's a group called the New Group of World Servers. In 1957, a book was written called The Externalization of the Hierarchy. This was by Alice Bailey. And it revealed that there were points of light, and those points of light were men who were inspired to leadership to bring about the new world. So when George Bush is talking about 1,000 points of light, he's sending signals to those men and women all over the world who are in key positions to illuminate mankind and eventually bring about world government. They are trying to illuminate man and bring them out of the outmoded darkness, as they say, of Christianity into the light of the new world order. Now listen carefully. George Bush's speechwriters said that they were the first ones to come up with the phrase New World Order. Listen carefully now. In 1957, 31 years before George Bush ever uttered those words in New Orleans, New World Order, one of the world's top occultists, a woman who first named her organization Lucifer Publishing, originated not only the phrase points of light, but also the term New World Order, and it's in her book, and you can read it for yourself. George Bush was only continuing the program, and he was sending signals to those who could understand all over the world that he was now going to try to complete the mission of the New World Order. But brethren, this is going to come down in our lifetime. There is no one who's listening in this live audience right now that's old enough not to see it happen. You and I are all young enough that we will see all of this happen in our lifetime. So when President George Bush said 1,000 points of light, he once again was sending signals that the illumination of mankind was about to occur. I want to show you now some of the occult uses of the number 1,000, just for a brief moment, so that you can understand what he's referring to. The number refers to the astrological sign of Aquarius. What's the new millennium coming up, the year 2000? The age of Aquarius, according to those in the occult. And they go by the zodiac. And it's connected with the new age and the new world order. The new millennium, 1,000. That's what millennium means. It mocks the coming millennial 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ, prophesied in Revelation 19 through 22. The 1,000 represents the serpent, or Lucifer. The Hindu version is Sesha, S-E-S-H-A, the 1,000-headed serpent of eternity. And what do those in the occult believe? When you read this book about the Rosicrucians, they never die. They just transcend. They are transposed into the next lifetime. It's evolution, forever and ever evolving upward. You see, reincarnation. That's why the 1,000-headed serpent of eternity is one of their symbols. And so the word, or the phrase 1,000 points of light, is very instrumental in the occult. It also, the head of Medusa, the evil Greek goddess, was said to be covered with a mass of 1,000 writhing, venomous snakes. And this is all a part of the occult beliefs. 1,000 is a mystical term implying an indefinite and countless number. One New Age globalist publication recently recommended that the United Nations be given taxing and bond authority to create revenue and tap widespread public support. Here's what the editor said, and it will constitute 1,000,000 points of light. That was found in their publication World Monitor magazine, February 1992. So the number 1,000 to them is very important in occultic literature. The Lucius Trust, in October of 1982, edition of Reader's Digest, page 203, put in a full-page ad of what is called the Great Invocation. And it said, I'll quote just one sentence, "From the point of light within the mind of God, let us stream forth in the minds of men." And those in the Luciferian organizations that worship Lucifer are the sponsors of this particular poem that was put into Reader's Digest. I want to get down toward the close now. In June of 1991, in the secluded Black Forest resort town of Baden-Baden, Germany, a very special group of influential men met to map out their final grand strategy for the next year and possibly beyond. They're called the Bilderbergers. Each of these well-known world leaders had come by special invitation. They could not come unless they were a member of a secret society. The general public was not invited. You and I are not the elite. We're only the masses. To be exact, the masses were locked out. Fortunately, a leak occurred. And so the information of the detailed meeting can now be known, all because of a leak. It seems that God always allows His people to know what Satan's doing, so they can stay one step ahead of him. Banking czar David Rockefeller, who was the former head of New York's Chase Manhattan Bank, also the founder of the Trilateral Commission, and at one time the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, gave the opening address to the Bilderbergers at Baden-Baden, Germany. He started off by telling those who were assembled, quote, "We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. End of quote. In other words, they never breathe a word that there is such a meeting that plans the world government every year. Rockefeller went on and said, quote, "It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world," his words, not mine, "if we had been subject to the bright lights of public scrutiny during these years." End of quote. So Mr. Rockefeller came out and said it plain, but he didn't expect there to be a leak. And so the very top person in the Bilderberger gives credit to the publishers of all the major publications where their head is invited to the meeting each year for cooperating in blacking out the contents of the meeting. They've cooperated in hushing up to the citizenry of every nation what they have been scheming and planning since their first meeting in 1954. Following David Rockefeller's welcoming address, the Bilderbergers, and remember each of the members has to be a part of a high secret society because they all work together in conjunction for world government. And that's why when George Bush sent out his signal, everybody who was in the occult and these secret societies knew the language. They knew what he was talking about. You and I stood there, what's he talking about? They knew. That's all that cared. They began to discuss the plan for a united Europe. It included plans for the common market currency to become one, and a central bank just like the Federal Reserve System in the United States. The Bilderbergers also laid out a blueprint on how they wanted the 1992 United States presidential primaries and hopefully elections in November 1992 to proceed. Invited secretly to that meeting in Baden-Baden, Germany in 1991 was a very key Democratic Party contender from Arkansas, Governor Bill Clinton. Clinton was questioned. He was auditioned by the high-ranking members of these secret organizations. He passed with flying colors. It was then decided that they would send massive amounts of money into his campaign fund. It also approved that these Democratic Party regulars that were invited in all 50 states that were controlled by the Bilderbergers would get in line and endorse Bill Clinton for the presidency on the Democratic Party. The Bilderbergers always hedge themselves. They make sure that they have one or more people that they back and control that's running from each major political party. George Bush is their boy wonder. From birth, he was brought up so that he would one day sit in the White House to fulfill his mission. He will be running in 1992 in November. Whether he becomes president again, we'll have to wait and see. If he doesn't, they have a man standing in the wings who is sponsored by the Bilderbergers. Remember, the Bilderbergers are philosophically neither Republican or Democrat. It doesn't matter to them who is in the White House, as long as they go by the agenda they laid down. Their goal is money, economics. Money is power. Power means they rule the world. Another individual was asked to come in private. This man has been saying everything that most Christians love to hear. We've got to get back to family values. His name is Vice President Dan Quayle. He also was questioned by those at the Bilderberger meeting, and he passed with flying colors. David Rockefeller and the other big wigs were very impressed with the things he had to say. You must remember he comes from a very wealthy family. They stated, and I quote, a Bilderberger member, "He's our man for 96 or sooner." End of quote. So what if the right man doesn't get into office? Could they frame someone to see to it? Or if that man that does get into office steps aside, like Richard Nixon, and tries to get out from under the wings of those in control, they have someone to take his place that they have confidence in. Let's go back now to Daniel chapter 8. Remember, it said right here that there would be someone at the end of the age who would rise up, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences. The only way this fits Bible prophecy is that it must be someone from the secret societies who understand occultic terminology. Because when you turn to Revelation 13, you see, and let's turn there just for a moment, I want to show just a couple of things in closing. In verse 1, it says, I stood upon the sand of the sea. This is mankind, looking over mankind, and he saw a beast, which according to Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel 7, a beast is a government. Rise up out of the sea of humanity. What do we see rising today? The United Nations organization, headed up by the military of the United States of America, who is headed up by a man that says he has a mission. And he sent out occultic symbols in his phraseology to anyone who can comprehend that he has the mission of spreading 1,000 points of light all over the world. Then in verse 3 or verse 2, it says the dragon. And the dragon in verse 9 of Revelation 12 is identified as Satan the devil, who was Lucifer before he rebelled against God. The dragon or the devil gave him his power. And all the occultic literature, all of them have identical beliefs. And Albert Pike, the great in Freemasonry, in the Scottish Rite, stated in his own book, Morals and Dogma, that they worship Lucifer, and Lucifer was God, and that the God of Christianity is a God of darkness that hates mankind. So they've got it backwards. But it's this God, Satan, will give rise to this end-time power. And then in Daniel 8, it said he would understand dark sentences, the occult terminology. Verse 3 or verse 4, they worship the dragon. Mankind will worship the devil and thinking that it's the true God. Why? Because Albert Pike said, we'll say to the masses we worship a God, but we'll not tell them the God we worship is Lucifer. So all of mankind will worship Satan the devil thinking that it's Jesus Christ. You and I will have no excuse. We've been told over and over from the pages of the Bible, and I've proven it from history, what's about to occur. Then verse 4, the latter part, it says, they worship the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast, who is able to make war with him? And in Egypt, they said they transferred the obelisk and all the sacred jewels of the Rosicrucian order and the master spirit, Satan the devil, to the United States of America. Who is it that the military force is enforcing the New World Order? The United States. Verse 5, and there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. It's blasphemy to say they worship God and deceive people to think it's Jesus Christ and God the Father, when it's Lucifer and Satan the devil. And power is given unto him to continue 42 months. Once this global government is established, it'll last 3.5 years. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy, verse 6, against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints. So you see, this occultic system is going to make war with those that will not fall into line with it and that will not worship Satan the devil. So you and I will be the official outcast, the official offenders of the New World Order. Verse 7, I'll continue. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given to him over all kindreds, tongues, and nations. So it's going to be global authority by this government and this individual. I don't know who it's going to be. I don't know if it'll be George Bush, if it'll be Dan Quayle. They will put up their own men. And when you read Revelation 17, it says there's going to be 10 global divisions. And a king will be over each one of those, and they'll give power to one man that'll be over all 10. So there'll be 11 men involved. One will be the super dictator over the whole world, and then 10 global governments, regions under that person. and they will fight the living Jesus Christ when he returns. Brethren, I hope this has given just a little more insight into proving that the Bible is true when it talks of Egypt as being spiritually of the devil. Because we went all the way back into history, in Egyptian history, in its founding, and found the beginning of all secret orders. And it is of the devil. So I just ask each one of you to make sure that your garments are always white, washed in the blood of Jesus Christ, and you live by his laws every day, and that your primary focus in everything you do is obedience to our God and not the God of this world, because he's the one that you will be contending against very soon.
Well, hello again, brethren. Thank you for joining us. I hope everyone enjoyed the message today titled United Nations History. I love these older messages, listening to these topics from back then and looking at them in place today. There's no denying that we're following the path that's dictated in the Bible. Well, I'm going to keep it short today. I have some fine-tuning to do on this new process that I'm developing. I've been forced to change my process from the VHS tapes. On the bright side, I may have shaved off about an hour on that process. Well, kind of. I was creating the DVD from the VHS, then to a digital MP4 so that I could edit to take out some of the long pauses and other things like that. Now I create the MP4 straight from the VHS. That way I can go back and create the DVD from the MP4 anytime I want. That can be after the broadcast. Instead of, I had to get it done before I could even do the broadcast the other way. Anyway, like I said, I'm going to keep this short. Don't forget, we have a double Sabbath. Pentecost starts at sunset this evening. That's less than 5 hours from now. Well, thank you again, brethren, for joining us today. And please join us again next week as we continue to unfold God's truth that he's laying out before us. And don't forget to join us tomorrow at 2 for the Pentecost message. Until we meet again, do not accept the mark of the beast, and let's make all our days worthy of God's blessings. May you all have a blessed evening, and goodbye for now.